Hi, I'm Tui De Roy, and I've lived here all my life in the Galapagos Islands. I came when I was 2 years old, when my parents decided to be pioneers here, and I've been photographing these islands now for 50 years. I've gone all over the world and photographed all sorts of wonderful things, and then I keep coming back and discovering just how special Galapagos is. What I would like to share with you today is not a lecture about photography, but rather a photographic story, which is my life in these islands and how I have observed the islands. I have discovered and rediscovered them over and over again through my lens. And that's really what I would like to show. So I would like to let the photograph speak mostly, and I will be doing the commentary for the photos rather than the other way around. And I hope you will enjoy this, because I'm really sharing what is very, very special to me, which are these incredible islands that I've had the great good fortune of spending more than half a century documenting with my camera. The Galapagos Islands, young volcanoes that are seemingly suspended in time and space, just like this giant tortoise in the sunrise glow, have been my home now for 65 years, and 50 of those years I've been photographing their wildlife and their wild places. And this is what I'd like to share with you today. I would like to call this Dreaming Through My Camera, because it's Galapagos dreaming through my camera or my lens. Because it's not about how I got the shot, it's more about the story of the wonder and the magic that I keep discovering through my photographs, looking at this peaceful scene, this peaceful volcano that can suddenly turn into an outburst of volcanic activity, lava flowing into the sea. Some of the wildlife will die, some will survive, some will adapt. And that's what Galapagos is all about. And that's really what makes me so passionate about these islands that are my home. And that's why I never ever get tired of photographing them, because every time you look, there is something new, something different, a moment in time that is unique. We have unique species here: penguins on the equator, iguanas that dive into the sea for their food, marine iguanas. But that's not really the point. The point is that each and every day over the last 50 plus years, I've always found something different to photograph. From sunrise with a frigate bird still resting on its perch, right through the day with giant tortoises grazing in their meadows while the volcano is puffing behind them, or as the sun sets over a flightless cormorant drying its wings. There are just endless and ever more moments that are so special, so unique, they never happen again. And the wildlife is calm and trusting, if you are calm and trusting with them, so that you can take it from different angles. You can use different lenses. You can choose what level you get at, and you can capture that spirit of wildness with the animals peacefully going about their lives as the clouds change, as the weather changes. And you can use different techniques, slow motion as the wave breaks over a feeding marine iguana, or a fast shutter speed to capture the wave in crystal clearness. But all of that really happens when you have time. And time is certainly what I've had in Galapagos, from the lovely morning glow of the sun coming over the horizon and the peaceful Nazca booby incubating its eggs, or an afternoon with a hawk looking for food, looking for its next meal while the island that it lives on is casting a shadow over the sea, and some more dynamic moments, behavior, activity, with the landscape included in the picture, It's one of the few places where you can really do wildlife photography with a wide-angle lens. The beautiful thing about Galapagos is that you don't always have to use a telephoto lens to do your wildlife photography. You can do a beautiful shot with a wide angle where you get the whole background and this beautiful landscape and the animal within the landscape. And that's what makes it so special, is that you really get the sense that you've got a wild animal in its environment. But not all photographs need to be taken with a wide angle, of course. Sometimes you want to focus on something very specific, like this blue-footed booby doing its courtship landing to impress its mate, or a little yellow warbler feeding in the tide line when the tide is going out, looking for little gnats in the algae, or a flightless cormorant trying to fly for just a moment as the tide comes in. And sometimes it's actually the wildlife that is still and the elements that are moving, like these Sally Lightfoot crabs waiting for the tide to go down and the waves are breaking over the shore. Or a booby that, after missing its catch during a dive, erupts out of the water and chases the needlefish on the momentum that it gained from coming up from a dive. That interface between air and water, air and sea, is so special, so full of energy, because so much in these islands happens at the waterline. You can see what's going on from above, and you know there's plenty more going on down below. This brown pelican that's just dived and has a beak full of fish, and the brown noddies are actually trying to cash in on that. If you look at it from below, it looks very different. In fact, I think a lot of people would be hard put to recognize a pelican when it dives, if you're looking at it from below. And it's not just pelicans. There are other animals, wildlife down here under the surface. The Galapagos penguins right on the equator, chasing little fish because of the cold currents that nurture the rich waters around these islands. And the largest of all the cormorants coming up from a very deep dive. They are the biggest, strongest cormorant because they've lost their ability to fly, so they can actually dive and chase fish underwater. And sometimes the best shot is actually above the water. I really like that interface between the two elements. Here's a marine iguana warming up in the shallows of a tide pool with the little pufferfish cleaning some bits of skin, or a freshly born little black-tipped shark baby in a very calm inlet with a giant cacti in the distance. And as you go deeper into these inlets, you reach the mangrove lagoons that are perfectly quiet, perfectly still, and you get surprises there too. A little sea lion coming in for a little playful romp, or sea turtles that, after feeding in the cold currents, come into these warm, sheltered waters to rest and digest their food. But when you go out into the deeper water, you see other aspects of their lives. This is looking down from the surface at a sea turtle swimming through a giant school of striped salimas, very gregarious fish. Or sometimes sea lions at play. These pups are playing with a chocolate chip starfish, passing it back and forth and letting it sink and then catching it again. These are these moments that happen only once, and if you're lucky, you might get it in a photo. The fish life under the surface is quite interesting in the Galapagos because of the mixing currents. So you have quite a few species that are found only here. And when you get into the deeper areas, the steep walls that drop off into the abyss, you get some incredible congregations of oceanic species like these scalloped hammerheads that migrate across the eastern Pacific and come back to these steep walls where unbelievable numbers of pelagic fish, tuna and various other kinds like jacks, and so many fish gather here as they pass through on their way to who knows where. And if you climb those walls and you get above the sea level, you find a whole other world of seabirds nesting on these islands. These are the northernmost islands in Galapagos, Darwin and Wolf. isolated outposts about 75 miles from the rest of the archipelago, and large numbers of seabirds come to nest here. But there's also land birds, one of the famous Darwin's finches, called appropriately the Vampire Finch, because these little birds, when it hasn't rained for quite a while, actually have learned to make a living from getting their food and moisture from the blood of the boobies. And they'll come and pick at a wound or even create wounds, tiny wounds at the base of the feathers of the boobies' wings, which bleed quite profusely but are not a severe wound. And from this they can survive during dry periods. So there are innumerable chances and surprises to be photographed. And after half a century, I still haven't run out. When the sun goes down, it's a whole other atmosphere that takes over. With the last colors of the sunset disappearing and the marine iguanas settling down for their quiet time as the day cools off, other things start to happen. A pelican takes off and goes out to try to catch the last fish of the day. A boobie, on the other hand, comes up and tosses a little herring, also his last catch of the day. This is a blue-footed boobie. A Nazca boobie, on the other hand, feeding further offshore, comes back to roost at the colony as the sun goes down. And it's a noisy affair because each one of them angrily reclaims its perch in amongst many others. The latecomers are literally looking like ghosts appearing out of the dark as they approach the island. But at that same time, another species is heading out to feed. This is the swallow-tailed gull, the only nocturnal gull in the world with huge eyes. And they fly out of their colonies just as the sun is setting and head out to sea to feed on squid. Their huge eyes are obviously what they use, but I also personally believe that they actually use echolocation because they make a clicking sound when they're zeroing in on squid that are leaping out of the water in the darkness when they feel disturbance. And they can catch squid that are almost as long as themselves and bring them back to feed their chicks in the morning. And then during the day, they're just resting, and so are the chicks under the protective cover of their parents, waiting for another night to come. During the daytime, the giant cacti that line the shoreline of many of the arid islands don't look like all that much. They're just part of the scenery. But come nighttime, these cacti acquire a different character. They sort of start looking like soldiers marching off into the distance, if you use a little bit of imagination. And if you use a 6-hour time lapse, you get the entire movement of the stars rotating around the southern hemisphere, looking south as the cacti are silhouetted. Other nighttime creatures come out, like the short-eared owl, which is found all over the world, but here in Galapagos looks a little different, smaller and darker, and they become active as the last light fades. This one was particularly curious of my flashlight that I laid on the ground so that I could photograph it, just from the light of the torch that it was investigating. Barn owls, too, are different, similar to the ones found the world over. And this pair of fledglings has just received a giant Galapagos centipede from its parents. Little sea turtles, green turtles hatching out in the cover of darkness, heading out for the sea and trying to run the gauntlet of predators that would be waiting for them if they were to hatch in the daytime. All these are moments that I've had the good fortune of capturing over and over again over the years. Sometimes even the scenery can be captivating at night. This is the Caldera of the youngest volcano in Galapagos, Fernandina Island. And over it, the clouds are drifting across the moon and the starlit sky, while in the distance, another volcano on Isabella Island is actually erupting and competing with the moon glowing in the sky. On another volcano on Isabella, without an eruption, the moon is just rising as the tortoises are sleeping below a spray of clouds, and nothing is stirring during the night, only lit up by the moon. By morning, as the first colors of dawn illuminate the sky, the tortoises start to stir, and they start to move out of their resting pools and into the landscape, looking for fresh greenery as the clouds are swept along by the winds, and those that linger in the ponds draw interesting designs in the mud wallows that they love to spend time in. And it's these magical islands that I had the incredible good fortune of spending almost my entire life, experiencing, exploring, discovering, and of course, photographing. And all of that I owe to two people. And these two people are my parents, Jacqueline and Andre De Roy, or De Roy if you pronounce it in French, came from Belgium, where I was born. And as a young couple, after the war-torn years of World War II, they had a dream. They wanted to live somewhere close to nature. Here you can see them in Corsica when they first married, before I was born. They wanted to live on a tropical island somewhere, and they came to Galapagos. This was our first home, a tent on a little platform on stilts in the cloud forest, where I spent my third year of life. We arrived in Galapagos on my second birthday. After a year, we moved to the coast, and there my brother was born in a little lava rock house with our faithful flock of milk goats. Life was very simple, very basic. We swam in the sea, we bathed in the sea, and for me, it was just a huge, wonderful learning experience. Nature was my classroom. I learned from the animals around me. My parents taught me how to read and write, but the wildlife, the wild animals were my friends, and I befriended many. I really had a wonderful childhood, but for my parents it must have been very, very hard, because making a living on a desert island when there is no cash economy, you have to build your own boat, you have to go out fishing and hunting to get food on the table and a little bit of milk from our flock of goats. But my father and mother were both artists, and they had many interests, particularly in nature. And my father was quite clever, really. He had made his own underwater camera. This is a photo that he took with his own homemade underwater camera back in 1952, before I was born. He was not happy with the results. The shutter speed was too slow, but he had no money to buy a camera. He just made his own. I actually borrowed one of his cameras when I started to become interested in the birds in Galapagos, and I wanted to record their life cycle. I took this picture when I was about 12 or 13 on one of his little cameras. But when I got my first SLR, I think that's really when I became hooked. And I like to say that my cameras have changed more than I have over the last half century. This was the first photo, the first roll of color film that I ever shot in my first SLR. That was in March 1969, and it's still one of the best photos of a great blue heron that I remember ever taking. And this photo was taken just over 50 years later, in July 2019. And there's been a few photos in between, obviously. A picture similar to this one graced the cover of Audubon magazine, which was my first cover story, which was published when I was just 19 years old. It was taken on Albatross Volcano on Isabella Island, and I've been back dozens and dozens of times to this incredible volcano. It hasn't erupted in living memory, but it has plenty of reminders of its volcanic origins. And here lives one of the largest populations of giant tortoises left in Galapagos. And so I've been back there over and over again. Here they are so numerous that they can actually shape the landscape. They create these close-cropped meadows and these dugout ponds that they scrape out where the rainwater gathers and stays for long periods after the rainy season. And so really, this is an opportunity to see the old and the new meet. A tortoise that could be 200 years old and a spider web that could be less than 2 hours old. And I've photographed this place. It's become part of me. The mating season, when the males become quite rowdy and quite obsessed really, as males do during the mating seasons, and the babies in the flower gardens that grow during the rains, the tortoises coming and going about their lives the way they have for thousands and thousands of years. And when it dries out, they just wait. They sleep away the days in the dust, waiting for the next rainy season. Occasionally, a funny encounter, a hawk uses a tortoise as a perch. And sometimes smaller birds. Here's one of the Darwin's finches that actually performs a cleaning service, and the tortoise stands up stiffly, waiting for the finch to clean the ticks off of its skin. And this is really the cycle of these islands that I've been part of for such a long time. But they were also my launching pad, because here is where I started, and from here I can say that my cameras have taken me all around the world. And they've taken me into very different dimensions, different climates, different environments, always in pursuit of the most pristine, the most remote, the most natural places that I could possibly reach. All the way from the Arctic, here on Bear Island, north of Norway, down to the Antarctic in a blizzard, which is the way you should see the Antarctic. It's far more interesting to see the penguins in the environment that they were made for than when it's bright and hot and sunny. I was once lucky enough to circumnavigate the entire Antarctic continent. I was the expedition leader on an icebreaker for 66 days, and we went deep into the emperor penguin country. I've also been to a few high places, like Tibet. That's me looking up at the north face of Mount Everest. And low places like the Atacama Desert, the seabird islands off the coast of Peru where the Peruvian pelicans nest, and to some rainforest like the Amazon, where I learned to climb trees and get into the topmost canopy to photograph some of the birds that are found only there, like the macaws and many other species up in the rainforest canopy 150 feet off the ground. I just always like to show the animals in their own element, being themselves, being wild, being part of nature. And when they give me a chance to be part of that wildness, that's when I really feel that I'm alive, such as this hornbill feeding its mate in a cavity nest in a tree in Indonesia, in Sulawesi Island. I've had the incredible luck to go to some places that I think no other photographers have been to, like this one, Torishima Island, south of Japan, an active volcano where I can freely say the most beautiful of all albatrosses lives, or comes to nest rather. They live in the ocean, they nest on land. And this bird, the short-tailed albatross, was actually considered extinct in the 1930s. It had been killed off for its feathers and its eggs, and it was gone. And it was about the time that I was born that a dozen or so birds returned from the ocean and started nesting again on the island when everyone thought that they were gone forever. And so on a project that took me nearly 15 years to complete, I did 2 books. One on all of the albatross species of the world, 22 species, and it took me to some of the most remote parts of the globe in the southern hemisphere. Some of the most colorful species, like the Buller's albatross on the subantarctic islands called the Snares, or the sooty albatross in the South Atlantic, to some islands that nobody had set foot on, the Bounty Islands of New Zealand, for 7 years when I was able to visit there. And to Gough Island in the South Atlantic, where the yellow-nosed albatross are found. Just a few samples of what this project actually entailed. And the other book, the twin project, was Penguins of the World, 18 species, also all over the southern hemisphere, from the very largest, the emperor penguin that nests on the sea ice, or rather lays its egg on the sea ice of Antarctica, to the smallest penguin, the little blue penguin of Australia and New Zealand that comes ashore under the cover of darkness. I've spent weeks camping amongst penguins in the Falkland Islands and elsewhere, and that's where I feel happiest, is just being out there, me with them, trusting me and me trusting them. Capturing sandstorms with the king penguins, seeing what the rockhoppers do best, which is hopping, and an occasional whoopsie, two Gentoo penguins colliding as one was jumping into the water as the other one was jumping out. But I've digressed quite a bit now, and I'll go back to Galapagos, where we also have penguins. But here, the penguins are actually in a different kind of company, with turtles and marine iguanas, sea lions, flightless cormorants. But all this was still during the days of film, which was quite limiting. And during a period of 40 years, I amassed what I considered to be a tremendous collection of photographs of Galapagos. I had about 80,000 pictures, all taken on film, all filed away, before the time of digital photography came along. So you needed to use fill flash to subtly light up the shadows. At night, you had to take long exposures. Long exposures meant that if the wildlife moved, it would be blurred. So it was very limiting. Sometimes blur was what you wanted if the animal didn't move. But it also gave me a tremendous perspective, a time perspective on some of the changes of the volcanoes that erupt quite frequently. This, again, is Fernandina Island, the western and youngest of all the Galapagos Islands, taken in 1975. And this is the same view taken in 2017. You can see how much the volcano has changed. And you can also see how the quality of the photography has changed because of the arrival of the digital age. But what I was after is how these iguanas actually live on this volcano, and the fact that most of the female iguanas actually go down into this caldera to lay their eggs in the warmth of the volcano on the caldera floor. And that's something that no other photographer has ever documented. So over the years, my first book was published in 1980 with a photograph similar to this one, not this exact one. And my second book came along in 1987 called Islands Born of Fire. And this was the cover photo, and that book is still in print today. It's my longest living book to date. In 2009, I published a book called Preserving Darwin's Legacy with this photograph on the cover. And last year, in 2020, my most recent book on Galapagos came out amongst 13 books that I've done on these islands. And this was a cover photo, A Lifetime in Galapagos. But I suspect it's not going to be my last book on these islands. They are just too magic to stop here. And I will continue to document that extraordinary nature, the extraordinary variety of wildlife, but not just the wildlife, the place, the atmosphere, the days and the nights that blend into each other, the wild weather that hits the shore where the marine iguanas are feeding, or just a seabird colony. But they're not looking at me, they're looking at something else that's far more interesting. Always trying to capture that feeling of place it can be quite messy because the black lava, the bright sky, the bright water, white beaches, dark animals, it's complicated to get into one frame. But I keep trying, and I keep finding special moments. A frigate bird displaying on a little bush, and underneath it a pair of Nazca boobies courting and looking after their eggs. It's kind of hard to just photograph landscape in Galapagos because the wildlife is so attractive. But sometimes the landscape in itself is really all that you need. The raw volcanic landscape and the bizarre plants that grow on it, or the changes of the seasons, the clouds building, forming, the rains falling, the sun setting. But it doesn't take long before I'm tempted to just get yet another animal in the scene. Sometimes I find that it's best to have the wildlife present as a kind of a backdrop, as an afterthought to the landscape, or just a texture. And in it is a red-footed booby, bringing a note of color. Or maybe just more texture. A stunted tree with various seabirds. Nazca boobies on the ground, and a frigate bird sitting on its egg, and a red-footed booby as well, sitting on its nest, all in the same tree. Flamingos casting their own reflection, as well as the reflection of a hill. So again, it's wildlife in context, wildlife in its wild place. A yellow-crowned night heron coming out as the sun goes down with a blowhole blowing in the distance. The dry vegetation dormant during the dry season with the brilliant spot of a frigate bird courting, showing off his huge balloon. You might ask, is this a picture of a wave of the sea, or is it a picture of a waved albatross? It's both, of course. And that's really what I like, is to show the wild animals being wild in their wild places. Here, wide open beach with two marine iguanas traveling in different directions. And it just so happens that a frigate bird flew over and cast its shadow. At night, those boulders are actually tortoises, barely noticeable. One of them moved during the time exposure. So this is just the mood of the islands, the mood of the cloud forest with the high note of a little vermilion flycatcher. But also a telephoto view of the same flycatcher and the warming itself in the glow of the morning sun on a fern about to unravel. Wide-angle wildlife photography is something I find really enticing because you can tell two stories in one. The story of the marine iguana in full breeding colors, as well as the story of the cold currents creating sea fog with a fog bow in the fog itself in the early morning. Or maybe the rainy season approaching, the big clouds forming over the warmer patches of water that are approaching the islands with a frigate bird just sitting on a branch. And is this about a pelican or about a rainstorm? Well, I guess it's a rainstorm with a pelican in it. I love clouds. I find clouds really quite interesting. They create another dimension. I think a lot of photographers like to have clouds rather than blue skies in their pictures. But here we can also have wildlife with those clouds. I use a fisheye lens quite a lot. That means, in order to avoid distorting the horizon, is putting the horizon in the middle. It's supposed to be a no-no in a lot of photography courses, but I've never taken a photography course, so I just take what happens to look good to me, and sometimes the horizon is in the middle. Sometimes it's just a case of a small note of wildlife in the big, wonderful landscape that they happen to move in. Like this hawk in the rainy season with a rainbow and the last glow of the sun just slipping through between the clouds. Or another Galapagos hawk setting up to hunt under a rather heavy sky. Those hawks are actually the top predators in Galapagos, the top land predators. And during the marine iguana nesting season, they can actually capture the females that are out on the sand and after eating part of it, take it back to its nest. This is a juvenile hawk having fun, it seems, perching on a giant tortoise, mating. So it's losing its balance all the time, trying to stay perched in place. They come and play in the steam, in the fumaroles. They play with each other. They're quite inquisitive and curious. But if you put a wide angle on, then you suddenly realize that they're part of a landscape, and a complex, huge landscape. I've often been asked if this was a photoshopped picture with several birds in the same frame. But no, here in Galapagos you can actually take wide-angle pictures of flying birds as well. Or like this one with the landscape behind it, a frigate bird. And the other way to integrate the wildlife in its landscape is to get down low, to get down at its level. It gives you the feeling of this flamingo just landing on the pool of salt water. Or a short-eared owl making contact. It's like a mesmerizing moment of eye contact with a bird in flight, and a wide-angle view just disappearing off into the distance on that smooth, smooth sea with a distant island and a Sally Lightfoot crab on a beach. Just moments in time. But when you have time, you get the moments. A sea lion rubbing its nose, just waking up in the early morning light. I once tried to do some movies, and I didn't actually like it because I had to premeditate what was going to happen. Whereas with still photography, I can just get that apex moment and preserve it. I don't have to worry about what's happening before or after. It's the moment of the land iguana eating this shore petunia in the late afternoon, or another land iguana eating a prickly pear cactus, spines and all, a fruit. And a sea lion playing with a Sally Lightfoot crab. You can also tell life stories. I love to tell life stories. That's what I set off to do 50 years ago. These are the frigate birds that seem to completely escape gravity. They just hang on the wind. They're not riding a thermal. They're just hanging on the wind. They're the lightest bird in the world to wing area to weight of body. They just simply defy gravity. But they're very clever hunters, and they can capture different prey on the wing, in this case a shearwater. And this one actually pulled the sea turtle baby out of the nest under the sand. It wasn't visible, but it actually got the cue of where the turtles were under the sand because it saw a heron pull one out of the beach. They are also much maligned for stealing from many other birds, like stealing nesting material from a red-footed booby, but that's what you have to do if you live on the wing. And you bring back your trophy to your mate sitting on the nest. The courtship display of the frigate birds is really quite magnificent when the males inflate their huge pouch that develops just during the courtship period, and the female pick the one with the most dazzling pouch of all. There can be some arguments between the males that could look rather dangerous. But as soon as the pair is formed and the union is sealed, then the pouch shriveled up and eventually will disappear into the male's plumage when they get down to the serious business of raising their family. The blue-footed boobies are another wonderful subject to photograph because they're such active birds. Their courtship dance is fascinating, including the showing off of their feet and sky pointing and various postures and noises, and it's a rich ground for photography. The courtship landing display and all that, of course, is all aimed at one thing, and that's having their little babies, which are very vulnerable, completely naked and devoid of down when they first hatch. But if the parents are able to bring back plenty of food, then they will grow quickly into large, strapping, downy babies. But the fishing tactics of the blue-footed boobies are quite amazing. I have watched it thousands, tens of thousands of times, and I have tried to capture it on film innumerable times, and it is just incredible how they dive. The speed at which they dive, about 100 kilometers an hour at least, maybe faster by the time they hit the water. I know that with a 2,000th of a second, I haven't actually stopped the action completely, as they pull their wings behind them to create this perfect arrow to hit the water. And when you're in the water, it sounds like an explosion. There's a cavitation produced by the bird as it enters the water and creates this channel behind it of air bubbles being dragged behind it. It sounds like an explosion underwater. It's so quick. And once they're under the water, they can actually chase their prey as well. It's not as though it stops here. They can actually fly under the water, well beyond where their original dive took them. It's really quite fascinating. The marine iguanas are another story, another wonderful story, because they are so photogenic in their kind of primeval look. They blend in with the lava. They live right along the shore. In fact, when Charles Darwin visited Galapagos, he called them imps of darkness. But I find them quite elegant, quite graceful, really, in their setting of dark lava shores and bright water, basking on the lava, clinging to the rocks, or going out to feed in the early morning, heading out when the tide is low to eat seaweed. They're quite good swimmers too. They can make it right through the breakers into the cold waters, but they can't stay in the water for very long. They graze the seaweed that covers the rocks under the water, but they can only stay at most about an hour in the water because they become too cold, being reptiles. So they have to eat fairly quickly, graze the lush seaweed fields that are nurtured by the cold currents, and then they have to make it back to shore in time to be able to warm up again. And here they bask on the shoreline, sitting in the sun. That's probably why they've become black. Their ancestors would have been green iguanas of South America, and here they can digest their food by warming up in the sunlight. If it rains, there's nowhere to go. They just wait for it to stop. And if the nights are cold, they gather up together to pool their energy. But come the breeding season, they become quite stroppy. And here the males are fighting for little territories where they can attract females to mate. It only lasts a few weeks. The rest of the time they're quite gregarious. And the females likewise, when they're laying their eggs, digging burrows in the sand, they become quite feisty for the best spots. The little hatchlings emerge a couple months later, and they have to run a gauntlet of predators, and they often stick close to adult iguanas, not that they're their parents or that they're being looked after, but just because it offers a degree of safety. They have many predators, like the great blue heron, that capture the small hatchlings when they go out to feed, and Galapagos snakes that are lurking right where the hatchlings emerge from the sand. But I find them quite sculpture-like in terms of photographs. When they're warming up in a warm tide pool, quite still, they're just really quite statuesque. Their textures and details. I don't think I'll ever get tired of photographing marine iguanas in Galapagos. But having talked about all the things that are fairly obvious, there are some that have surprised all of us everywhere in the world, and me more than anyone. Behaviors that we never knew existed. It's only a few years ago that this behavior was discovered. There are just 2 little coves in Galapagos where old wise bull sea lions have learned to actually herd yellowfin tuna from the open ocean into these coves and trap them there. The tuna can swim much, much faster than the sea lions, but these old bulls actually know how to herd, how to intimidate the tuna in the same manner that sheepdogs drive sheep, by cutting off their exit and slowly driving them into these traps. And as they get into the shallows, it becomes quite wild. The younger bulls don't know quite how to do it, and they chase the fish, but the older bulls just cut off the escape. And in so doing, they actually trap them in these shallow channels and inlets in the lava. And you can see the enormous size of these tuna that these bulls are able to catch to feed themselves and fatten up so that they will be the beach master during the breeding season. At this point, when they really reach the shallows, it becomes quite wild, and it's a complete frenzy with the fish already injured, still trying to escape, and the sea lions driving them right into the shallow and right onto the shore. And once they've captured them, then they actually take them back into the water, and that's when they start to feed and rip the tuna apart. And it's just an absolutely phenomenal thing to observe. And I believe that I'm still the only photographer to have completely photographed this process here, because it's only in the last few years that this has been discovered. How the bigger bulls get the biggest share. They eat the best part of the fish. The younger bulls then eat what's left. And of course, they're not the only ones. The sharks follow close behind, and sometimes the sea lions follow close behind the sharks. They don't seem to mind, but the sharks try their hardest to actually steal the food from the sea lions, and sometimes they succeed. Here's a tug-of-war between a black-tip shark and a big bull sea lion right along the shore. And in this case, the shark got the prize, and the sea lion's still chasing it, trying to get it back, but he's not going to get it this time. There's a whole retinue of scavengers and opportunists that come along to get their part of the catch. Here's a frigate bird just pulling the food right out of the sea lion's mouth. Even the Galapagos hawks come in for the scraps, the heads that the sea lions don't eat. Pelicans, crabs, other fish, all sorts of scavengers come along. It's just a wild, absolutely wild scene in these 2 places where the sea lions do this. And even more recently, I discovered something that nobody else had ever seen before, and in a way even more fascinating. This is a place where an entire group of sea lions will actually collaborate and work together to drive very fast swimming scad, which are small fish like mackerel, very quick, and it takes a whole group of sea lions swimming at absolutely full speed to drive them through the open water into a little cove. And the pelicans are quite aware of this, so they're following close behind. The sea lions are nearing the shore, swimming at absolutely full speed, porpoising to catch a breath. And seen from the top of the cliff is where you first start to see the school of these mackerel-like scad that are being driven straight up onto the beach and immediately being attacked by the sea lions and the pelicans. And it's just an absolutely wild, wild feeding frenzy where pelicans and sea lions are grabbing fish right, left, and center, and the whole thing lasts about half a minute. And in that much time, all the food, all the fish are being consumed by pelicans and sea lions, and before you know it, they all had their own way with a belly full. It's just an incredible sight to see, and that it had been happening here under our noses, under my nose, for 50 years, and it's only a couple of years ago that I discovered this particular cove where this behavior takes place. It just gives me goosebumps to think about it. But before I finish, I just want to go back to one of my favorite little birds, and also one of the famous birds in Galapagos. In fact, the 17th species of Darwin's finches, who acquired his name long after Darwin came to Galapagos, in fact, long after he died. But these birds have become famous for how they illustrate evolution. Different species have adapted to different ways of feeding. The small tree finch here eating aphids on the flowers, the cactus finch feeding on nectar and pollen. And well, each one has its niche, but they're all very similar to each other, and as a result, they really demonstrate evolution. But for me, it has nothing to do with evolution, because when I was a little girl, I was befriending all these little animals around me, and I managed to get a family of finches come to my hand. And then more finches came, and more finches came, and I grew up and I traveled the world. And when I returned from time to time, my mom was still feeding the finches, and there were more and more of them coming around, and so I would join her and relive old memories and share new stories. And when my mom turned 80, she said, I really want to do something different. I want to go on a camel ride in the Sahara, in the sand dunes. So we went to Morocco and went on a camel trip in the Sahara, and then she said, I want to go dog sledding. So we went to visit some friends in northernmost Norway in the middle of winter, and she took me and my brother and his wife and daughter along, and we went for a short but fascinating dog sled ride through the snowy landscapes of the winter in northern Norway. And that really was the spirit that my parents gave me, and the greatest gift of all was this curiosity about exploring and seeing the world. And so I would like to dedicate this presentation to two very special people, Jacqueline and Tui De Roy, my parents. My parents are the ones who made me who I am, who gave me Galapagos for my second birthday. Every time I go out into the wilds of Galapagos, my whole way of thinking, my whole way of looking at things completely changes. I just become totally engrossed in my surroundings. I become hypersensitive to the smallest little things. And it's not just the photography, but the photography is the result of that new state of mind. And I move slower, I'm silent, and I just take it all in and pick out those moments that I consider to be really the special moments. And I've taken that with me to other places in the world, but I think it's because I know Galapagos so well that it has such an effect on me. It's because I really am under the skin of this place. It's just like magic. I rediscover the pleasure of discovering Galapagos through the eyes of people who come here. And visitors, tourists coming to Galapagos are incredibly important. They're incredibly important to the future of the islands, because it is thanks to them that we have the tools to preserve the islands, to protect them, to defend them against fisheries, against all sorts of other pressures. Without tourism, the islands would be lost. And in that role, Lindblad Expeditions has played an incredible position, an incredible role to put forth the values of travel and combine that with the values of conservation. And I'm really proud to have been part of developing that program here in Galapagos and seeing it blossom. And now, as we hopefully get over the worst part of the pandemic, seeing it being reborn as we speak.